Hello, friends. Good evening. Welcome to History Happy Hour, Indiana Soul Music discussion about Lamp Records. My name is Nicole Martinez-Lagrange, and I'm the coordinator of multicultural collections here at the Indiana Historical Society. It's great to see many of you here with your beverages. This happy hour is brought to you with support from it's brought to you with support from One America Financial Partners, a national provider in the insurance and financial services marketplace. It is also presented in partnership with Cultural Manifesto, a radio show exploring the wide spectrum of global culture and music hosted by Kyle Long, with whom you'll hear from tonight. The Indiana Historical Society, we are Indiana's storyteller, connecting people to the past. We do this by collecting upon millions of paper-based items, books, paintings, letters, photographs, diaries, maps, etc. And then we find interesting and exciting stories and ways to share it with you through publications, books, exhibits, and Zoom programs like today. Before I introduce Susan Hall Dotson, our moderator, I have a couple of Zoom logistics. Hang on. All right, can you all see my screen? Let me go back to Zoom. One second. All right, and so you'll see that you've all been muted. And so, yep, and so you'll see here on the top. So make sure that, that you are on mute. So now I'm going to toss it over to Susan Hall Dotson, who is our collections coordinator for African American history here at the Indiana Historical Society. And I will let her complete the introductions. Susan?
Hello, everybody.
Hi there.
And welcome, and I'm so glad you're here tonight for its happy hour. And what we do every happy hour, we talk about what we're drinking. So I'm gonna kick it off. Since I'm in my office, I do not have an adult beverage. I have some cherry Coke in my pretty warmer, colder, chiller glass. So Mr. Miller, please share with us what you have for happy hour this evening.
I have a bottle of Lamp Record water, filtered reverse osmosis, which means it's clear and clean.
That's the fountain of youth, sounds like to me. How about you, Mr. Kyle Long? What about you? What are you drinking?
I wanted to get in the spirit, so I'm having a glass of just red wine. Yeah.
And Nicole, last but not least? There you go, and you muted yourself. Unmute yourself, Miss Nicole. Anyway, thanks for being here. And I'd like to start out with introducing Herb Miller. Herbert Miller Sr., who is the founder of Lamp Records. That's why we're here. But I also want to reach out to Kyle Long, who is a music aficionado, particularly as it relates to the city of Indianapolis. He has his own show at WFYI. He also spins in clubs. So if you're out there and you need to go shake a leg, you need to follow Kyle. But I want to start with Kyle first. Kyle, how did you intersect with Mr. Miller so that, and you were able to then bring him to us?
Exactly, sure, understood. Yeah, so as you mentioned, I'm a DJ, and part of being a DJ is doing what we call digging in the crates, which is searching for rare, unique, and unusual music that we can share with our audiences. And I spent a lot of my youth in dirty flea markets and garage sales, crawling on my hands and knees, looking through moldy crates of records, trying to find something interesting and cool. And the more and more I did that, I started discovering all these really unique records with these bright yellow and orange labels. They said Lamp Records, and they were made here in my hometown of Indianapolis. And the music was fantastic. It was like the Motown music I'd grown up hearing on the oldies radio my mom listened to. So I started getting this real fascination about who made this music? Where did it come from? What were the circumstances that this Lamp Records evolved in? And I kept hitting a lot of dead ends. There wasn't a lot of information about the label during my time growing up in the 90s. And at the dawn of the internet, there still wasn't much information. So I realized that if I wanted to learn more about this music and the people who created it, I was going to have to get directly involved. So with the help of some very kind, wonderful, and incredibly talented people like Herman Slaughter, Rodney Stepp, Lester Johnson, all musicians who recorded for the Lamp label, I was eventually able to meet the great Herb Miller, who founded this label, who we consider, us soul music fans, our Berry Gordy here in Indianapolis. And yeah, so I realized that if I wanted to know more about this story, I was just gonna have to get involved and start documenting it myself, along with a lot of other people like David Williams and a man named Jason Yoder, who used to work here locally as well. So yeah, that's it in a nutshell.
Oh, great, great. I too am a former DJ, radio DJ, club DJ, and I was also a child of the era of Lamp Records. So I remember actually going and buying 45s, but I'm from the East Coast. I'm a New York native, Brooklyn, New York native, and I don't recall Lamp Records. So Mr. Miller, please tell us what was unique about the sound. I remember Watt Stax and Motown, Atco, and so many others of the day. What made Lamp Records unique to indie in its sound, and how did you start Lamp Records and why?
Well, it had a unique start. Actually developed from something that I didn't think would ever get to this point. But I was with two clubs in the late 50s, early 60s. The Gladiators, which was a car club, and then the Defiance Club, which was a social club. And we started promoting shows here locally in Indianapolis with local talent, and then that turned into national talent from James Brown, The Temptations, all of the major artists. We bought into Indianapolis at some point in time in the late 50s and during the 60s. And so I got involved in the record business by opening up a record shop. And I opened Good Vibrations Records, the first store. I had 4 stores at one point. And the first store was across the street from Attucks High School on West 10th Street. Building still exists there, it's still a shopping center. And I was right on the northwest corner. And the shopping center had groups that would perform like at a carnival type situation. And I had the opportunity to listen to a group called the Highlighters. And they were very young teenage kids, playing with what they had as far as musical instruments, but I liked the sound. And I hooked up with the Highlighters, and there was a female group also, the Tridels. And I hooked up with them and started to manage them, and then realized that if these groups are going to go anyplace, they were going to have, they'd have to be recording artists. So from that point, it just launched on to me advertising. Lamp Records itself didn't come around until after I started into this. I had a company called Sunset, and then I had another production company, and we were going to start a record label. I became involved with someone from the Indianapolis area who was interested in boxing, and he wanted to promote boxing. I wanted to promote music, and we got together and performed and formed L&M Productions, which was Layden and Miller Productions, and that's how the lamp name was developed. L for Layden, and A for M for Miller, and P for Productions. So that's how we came about. We were at 1919 East 52nd Street, and we moved out of that building and built an area into a strip mall out on East 38th Street, and it just all developed from there. Once I had the opportunity to work with some of the groups, and the advertising that we were doing in the recorder brought people in and groups in and individuals in and everyone in that everyone wanted to record. So it was just a process where I had to sample out what everyone was doing, what I thought was good, what I thought was bad, develop a sound. And it was just a lot of things that had to be done. But I was fortunate enough to have people like Lester Johnson and Rodney Stepp, who were very young people at that time. And they came together with their groups. Lester, more specifically, because his band, which was called the Ebony Rhythm Band, his band backed a lot of the groups and did the instrumentals. I made a contact with a recording company here in Indianapolis, a gentleman who's deceased now. His name was Les Ullman, and allowed me into his studio and allowed me to, which is something he really was not wanting to do, but he did. We developed a working relationship. So he allowed me to set up the controls where I could listen, where I could develop this sound. And so it was just a compilation of all of the things that happened to come together. And eventually I had groups like the Vanguards and all that we just got together and did a thing, and it worked.
Great. Tell me something. You talk about the sound. So we know that Detroit, Motown called themselves the sound of young America. Watt Stax had a little harder driving soul sound. Philly had its own sound later with Gamble and Huff. How would you describe the Naptown sound? And did it have its own unique sound in the soul and R&B genre?
Lamp had its own unique sound, and it was something that was in my head. And I can't describe it, but I knew what I thought had a great sound, and it was just a matter of trying to put the people together to try to put the sound together. And so it's just like Somebody Please. The Vanguards cut Somebody Please, and I listened to that song. And I used Somebody Please because that's one of the that was our biggest seller. That was the big thing, the Vanguards and Somebody Please. Actually, the record's still going out on the East Coast, and in the Hispanic community, they just love it, I guess. So there was a fellow that I had met, and he calls himself now Elvis Aggie, but Aggie was a young kid here that played in a musical group, and he played guitar. And it was a sound that I was trying to develop, and I sat in Les Ullman's studio after Somebody Please was already cut. We'd already done the vocal and the instrumental track. And I just felt that I had to bring that sound out a little more. And so Aggie and I sat down at Les Ullman's and worked for hours to put the guitar opening into that song, which was, like I say, it was already finished, but it just wasn't correct. So it just something that rang in my ears. I mean, you know, it was maybe the same thing with Berry Gordy. You know, the Motown had their unique sound, and it was something that he wanted to develop. And so I felt like this was Indianapolis' unique sound. So that's what I was working toward.
Is it possible, Nicole, that we could just hear a little quick snippet of the Vanguards so we can hear what that sound is, what it was like?
We sure can.
Okay. It's just going to take a few seconds so we can all listen to that. And here goes some great pictures of them. I noticed on the bottom of that promo picture that it was distributed by Atlantic, Atco, Cotillion Group. Was the imprint on the 45 on this the lamp yellow, or did it come out on one of the other labels?
There at first there was a label, and that was before they wanted the music produced before we could get our logo and everything, and they just wanted the record out. So all of the promo copies were not all on what we called gold and yellow. I mean, there were other color labels we used, but the first Somebody Please was on a multicolor record, and it had L&M Productions on it, and it was an Atlantic Cotillion was not involved in the first release. After Vanguard's the Somebody Please took off, and I got really interested. I started traveling and went out to California. I remember KGF was the soul station out there, and that's the Wiz one. That's not the original. That's the short version. The that's not. You don't have. No one has. I think Ethan is the only one that has a copy, the original copy.
Wow.
And not the original copy, but the original version. And that version is the original version is on the anthology. That Wiz situation was a whole different set of circumstances. But when I went to KGFJ, I had some contacts, and they pointed me in the Atlantic record direction. So I went to Atlantic in New York and developed a communication with them. They started producing the first national release of Somebody Please, and things were going so good when the other groups that we had coming up, and I convinced them. I actually had an office at 1300 Avenue of the Americas out there, so I could be close to the music business. And I was also on the Indianapolis Fire Department. So I worked 24 on, 48 off, and on my 48 off, I was flying to New York, and because I spent 1 or 2 days sometime through in New York. And then we got our distribution deal. That was when things really took off. So I had the music, I had the connection. I had the distribution. Then what I had to do was to keep the groups intact. That's where the difficulty was, in trying to keep the groups intact. And that was something I didn't bargain for. I didn't think that would be an issue. But you take young kids and other people, and the group's already out there now. So there were people selling the grass is greener on the other side, and I always say that I had a manicured lawn, well watered, but it got brown in the winter, of course, because that's what grass does. Well, they look across the street and see that green grass, and so that's where they wanted to go. And when they got over there, they found out that was artificial turf on top of asphalt. So the whole thing didn't evolve, and that was the reason that things started to go a little bit different. So in order for me to advance out and get into that Motown vein, something happened that I didn't realize until it happened. Was certain group of people contacted me and wanted me to come to Chicago and have a meeting. They wanted to set up a recording studio in the Chicago area. Well, of course, being on the fire department, I wasn't about to move because I'm looking at long-term situation. The fire department is all about my pension. So I was not going to jeopardize that for the music business. But I met them in Chicago. They had a briefcase, had $125,000 in cash money. And well, in the process of the meeting, and they realized that I wasn't going to move to Chicago. They were going to do it. We could do it in Indianapolis. And I knew something wasn't right, but one of them said to me, there were four of them. Now you understand, this is him speaking to me, that not 5 cents of this money is to go for anything other than Lamp Records. And I thinking, okay, what happens if there's a clerical area? I'm sorry. If there's an error in the financial picture here, someone's going to come looking for me, and it's going to be ugly. So I said, I'll get back with you. And they're still looking for me to get back with them. So, and that's when I decided, I sent the Vanguard. Well, I sent the Vanguards went to California. Ebony Rhythm Band turned into this group here, the Ebony Rhythm Funk Campaign, and they went to. I sent them to California, and again, things didn't measure up because I had a different outlook. They just had one version of what they thought they needed to do. I had another version of what I thought they needed to do. So I still managed to record a lot of local people. I didn't realize until the anthology came about that we cut as much music as we did. So had all the groups stayed together, had everyone stayed with the grass that got brown in the wintertime, we probably would have made the Motown fame. We would have been.
I got a couple questions about the groups.
So,
Herb, before
okay.
the Ebony Rhythm Funk campaign, you said they left before they went to California. Where did they go?
They went from here to California.
They went straight to California. Okay. So one of my questions, I'm gonna come back to them in a second, but there's always 2 degrees of separation. I'll let you all guess what that is. But were all the groups from Indianapolis? Were they all from Indiana? You talk about the sound, and they eventually went elsewhere or were trying to go elsewhere. Because as my mother would say, the grass is always greener on the other side until you have to mow it. So were they all indigenous, homegrown, homebred, from Indianapolis or just Indiana?
They were all homegrown Indiana people, except for a couple of the people that were with the Moonlighters were from Kentucky. And I think the Moonlighters originated in Kentucky, and I'm not really sure. But most of them, this was all home.
Great. Were you ever looking for talent outside of Indianapolis and Indiana?
No.
Why not?
No, people came to me, talked to me, but this was, well, you know, it was the Naptown sound. That was that's what we were trying to develop, the Naptown sound.
So,
Or that's what I was,
was there
the Naptown sound.
was there any other competition right here in Indianapolis during that time?
Oh yes, there were other people that were talking to these groups. Once I got them recorded and they started to perform and do, they came out of the woodwork to try to intervene, and they were successful at some of them. And what I said was to the groups, if you feel like you can make it better someplace else, the door is always open. I never tried to bind a group by contract and force them to do something that they thought they could do better someplace else. So always an open door. I mean, you come in and record, they came in and recorded, they decided they wanted to leave and find a different avenue. I was always open and receptive to that. I do business a little bit different, or did business a little bit different. It's always business to me. And it's always, it has to be done right, or we're not going to do it at all. And I mean, I dealt with these, some of the teenagers, I dealt with drugs and dealt with some other things that just, they weren't in my platform. They weren't in my way of life. And so that caused some issues. Drugs was a primary reason for a lot of things that happened with the groups. And so that's just the story. I mean, nothing negative. I'm friends with everyone that's still alive.
Okay.
James Davis went to be a minister. He was the vocalist on the Vanguard, Somebody Please. And yes. James and I were good friends, and we're good friends for years. And he passed away last year. And one of the saddest days in my life was I went out to see him the day before he passed away, and his sister called me. And but there are a couple of others that went on to be ministers, and those that are alive now are all good people. Lester Johnson, Pam, Ricky Jackson, he's in Florida, and they just, and so even though they didn't make it or with me in the music business, they stayed in the music business. Rodney Stepp, these guys are all in the music business, and I think they're doing fantastic as individuals. And I hope that some of the influence that I tried to give them years ago, they've taken that and turned their lives around, which they actually have. Beautiful people now, but it just didn't work during that time. Too many young minds with too much outside influence that, in my opinion, was just not the way to go. And it's not my way or the highway. It's the right way or no way.
Understood. Question about the Ebony Rhythm, say their name, Ebony Rhythm Band. Is that the same band as the Ebony Rhythm Funk Campaign?
Yes, they started out as the Ebony Rhythm Band. And Lester Johnson, who's here in Indianapolis, and Ricky Jackson is in Florida. And and Pam Tanner, who other groups, she ended up merging with them when they went to California. And that's when they, I think they changed into the Ebony Rhythm Funk campaign. This album here was, I took that photograph at my record shop, Good Vibrations, over on 10th Street. And that was right before they joined up and went to California. But they originally were this group, the Ebony Rhythm Band, and which I was more conducive to. The Ebony Rhythm Funk campaign was a little above my expectations as far as the music was concerned, but they had their own sound, and they were, so that's the reason I, said, hey, if you guys think you can make it in California, and Lester tells a story about it. I bought them a van and sent them to California to try to make it on their own, but it didn't happen.
Well, the reason I bring that up again, though, because until a few weeks ago, as I'm new to Indianapolis, I hadn't heard of Lamp Records. So today I share going over my notes with my husband, and he says, that's my cousin, Uncle George Denny, who was in the group. Maybe not during Lamp time, but during the California time. We haven't figured out how to disseminate all of that. But how many of the groups that left came back?
Everyone that left, left. And then after I had the meeting in Chicago, there was Tony Black who cut a record, and Tony was right at the time. Tony was a very nice young man. He wrote music, and so I cut a record on Tony Black. That was about the time that I had the meeting in Chicago, and they wanted to make that connection with them. And I found out that I couldn't get Tony's record distributed. And I finally found out that I couldn't get it distributed because I didn't take the suitcase with the money. So with everything else, I decided, well, this is just not the time or the place for this. It ain't going to make it. I've got other things that I'd like to try to do. And I went, like I said, I had the record business, and then in the part of the business that I didn't even know existed or thought about was distribution. And there were no big, real good outlets for soul music at that time. So I opened up another company called Indie Record Distributing Company. And so with the Indie Record Distributing Company, I moved off to distributing labels and distributing music. Actually, we distributed the last Elvis Presley album for Airway at the time. So I just kind of let the music and the label and everything just go. I just I let it go and moved on. But it was not. Met Ethan Applet. He owns Now Again Records. He came to my office. I got into the forensic business, but that's another story. The forensic investigation company, and Ethan showed up at my door about 20 years ago. My office is on 96th Street behind Bill Estes Chevrolet, and wanted to talk to me about Lamp Records. He knew more about me and Lamp Records than I knew. And he'd been running around digging up these records like Kyle was doing. And he wanted to get involved with me to do this anthology. And he did take some of the music that we could. And he's the one that did the Ebony Rhythm Band, Funky 16 Corners. He did the Fabulous Souls and a couple of other groups. That was my water, so I got to stick with this. So and a couple of other groups, and uh, fees, and finally, last August, we finally got enough music have finally got all of the music that was out there. I had some of the records and some of the masters and some of the things stored away, but they were not available to me. So, and it took 20 years, but Ethan is the mastermind behind the anthology.
Okay.
We worked together, and then Kyle got involved. Like I say, Lester Johnson was involved. Rodney. Everyone got involved that was around, and put this anthology together, and it revived the Lamp Records, and it revived
I want to take this to
the music.
I'd love to bring Kyle in on that right now to talk about his pursuit of Lamp Records, but also where he sees and how you see the influence of Lamp Records on current artists and future artists after 1972.
Yeah, I think maybe I can add a different perspective to that, because Herb is in the center of all this action, and sometimes you don't have the same vantage point as someone looking from the outside in. So I've seen a different side of this story and how it's progressed. And this music has disseminated and flourished all over the world. Soul music fans and record collectors on multiple continents seek out these records. Some of the Vanguard's records, the rare ones, sell for upwards of $4,000 to $5,000. So this music is highly sought after by soul music fans, DJs, and record collectors around the world. It's really only grown over the years in many ways. Of course, the Vanguards had 2 hit records in '69 and '70, but the kind of consciousness of Lamp Records as an entity, and its representation of Indianapolis as having a sound, as Herb spoke to earlier, that has only grown over the years. And you talked about the influence of this music on a new generation of artists. That can be seen in a very profound way through sampling and hip hop music. Amnesty is one of the great bands that emerged from Lamp Records. They were almost like an Earth, Wind, and Fire style group, in the sense that they had horns, they had a whole chorus of vocalists that performed with this group. Amnesty's music, when it was released, didn't really travel far beyond Indiana. But in recent years, it's been sampled in major works and hit records by artists like Jay-Z and Kanye West. So all this collective activity, the assemblage of the Lamp Records anthology that came out last year, the use of this music in sampling, the pursuit of these records by collectors like me and collectors all around the world have just created this synergy around the label that has made it in many ways more important and more influential than it was during the time it was active. So again, it's a testament to the vision of Herb Miller, who documented this aspect of our culture in such a way that it was able to travel and have these legs and have such a wide influence and carry this sound to every corner of the world where people enjoy funk and soul music.
Of all the records that you've collected and found in your pursuits through flea markets or record stores, which artists did you find the most of?
The Vanguards, of course, because they did have 2 hit records. So many copies of their singles were pressed by Lamp Records. So Somebody Please, or It's Too Late for Love, which was actually the Vanguard's biggest hit record. Those records you'll still see to this day, kind of floating around at record stores. Some of the rare ones, like the Ebony Rhythm Band's record, are more elusive, I guess. But yeah, the Vanguard's records are out there, and they're plentiful. They sold a lot of copies.
And who are some of the bigger acts that have covered the Vanguards?
That have covered, well, the Vanguards, the most enduring work of art that arose from Lamp Records is undoubtedly Somebody Please, which was written by the late, great James Davis and was the first big record that Lamp released. This song has touched people all over the world. The guys from Jodeci, Casey and JoJo, have recorded Somebody Please. Herb alluded to this earlier. In East Los Angeles, the heart of Los Angeles's Chicano Mexican-American community. This song has touched people so deeply. It's almost unbelievable. The song has been translated into Spanish and covered and sampled by multiple generations of artists. Going back to 1970, just a few weeks after the record was released, a garage rock band released a cover of the song on an album titled Chicano Voices Explode. And to this day, young kind of neo-soul Mexican-American Chicano artists from East Los Angeles continue to reinvent this song and reinterpret it. So Somebody Please has been performed by multiple generations of artists from all over the world. Sly, Slick, and Wicked, a famous 70s soul group, have done a cover of the song as well. So yeah, just off the top of my head, I mean, this song has had
That's
such
okay.
a life. It's unbelievable. Yeah.
That's
And
a lot.
grassroots thing too, Susan. Like Herb talked about a studio where this music was recorded. It was literally in a guy's basement. You know, Herb didn't have a lot of capital to make all this happen. And it's again a testament to his genius. There were dozens of labels in Indianapolis, hundreds of labels in Indiana that all wanted to have a hit record, but they didn't. Herb kind of cracked the code. He called on all these contacts and he had in the music industry and kind of figured out the algorithm to get this song in rotation and to get it into airplay. And, you know, I think the guy's a hero of Indiana culture. And, you know, I have tremendous respect for what he documented through the creation of this label.
Oh, great. I agree with you on that. I'm going to go to one of the questions we had, and it goes into Kyle's answer just now, but how did you fund the beginning and the start of Lamp Records?
Out of my pocket. I was, you know, I was, like I said, on the Indianapolis Fire Department, worked a part-time job, and just funded it with the money that I had, and what we generated, I put back into the record business because I had a job. So as long as I had enough to feed my family and do the things I needed to do, everything that this music company generated went back into the music company, 100%. So that's where the funds came from, originally from my money. Never had a loan.
Okay.
Never had a loan.
That's amazing. That's a testament to true entrepreneurship and the spirit of having it and doing it on your own. Someone else asked a question about the distribution. And so you did say you dissolved Lamp Records because of this outside influences coming in. Did you dissolve it, or did you release your artists from contracts to go to other places, since some of them were already being distributed by, say, Atlantic and AGCO, et cetera, but
Okay, I was the Atlantic contract. I mean, that was my contract with Atlantic Cotillion. And I think Kyle knows better than me, that I think we distributed 3 or 4 45s through Atlantic. So all of those deals were made with me, but I had no solid contract with the groups. The groups had an open door. I had my percentage from promotions and whatever the record business was. Their funds were their performances, and so it was just like this bottle of water. It was a clean deal, and they could leave and go any place they wanted to. So when I dissolved the company, everyone had a place to go and took that avenue.
Another question, you talked about 45s. A lot of young people don't know what 45s are. They hardly know what albums are. But how many were recorded as 45s, an A and B? Or how many full complete albums did you release under Lamp?
Okay.
I have the only, I have a copy of the only LP Herb released right here. It's a gospel LP by the Mighty Indiana Travelers. But this was it, Herb, right? This was the only LP you released during the original run.
Yeah.
Yeah, there it
Right.
is. Yeah.
Here it is. Right here. That was
Okay.
the only actual LP that we cut. Everything was 45. CDs, of course, were non-existent at that time.
Nope.
So the LPs that have been cut on LAMP were all products of Now and Again. And I gave Ethan full run of whatever he wanted to do with the music. And like I say, people like Ethan and Kyle have reintroduced this thing to the point that it amazes me because I didn't know all these things were going on. I had started a forensic company after I left the fire department in '84, and I was traveling all over the country and halfway around the world. And music was far and away from anything that I thought about until
Could
Ethan
you
walked into my.
Kyle or Mr. Miller, could either one of you speak to the technology of the day? You know, we look at recording studios now, they're multi-tracks, and as you said, there were no CDs then. How sophisticated, for any of you who may have gone on, say, the Motown tour and, you know, the echo chamber and a hole in the ceiling, what type of technology did you use to record and to then press these 45s?
Well, and people of today's world will laugh at this, but we went from 2-track to 4-track, and that was a big deal. And then finally we got 8-track, and man, it was just blown away. Now there are more tracks that you can count, and all of the digital information that's put into music. But what we did was the real deal. You know, I mean, we mixed it, I mixed it, and with 4-track and 8-track, and did the best that I possibly could with my own ears. But now there's so much digital involved in music that you don't know whether the music's good or bad. But it's.
How about you, Kyle? What do you think about how music is produced today versus how it was produced in the late 60s into the 70s?
Yeah, most of the LAMP records, as Herb mentioned, were produced on very rudimentary equipment. He mentioned a guy named Les Omnit, who, as I referenced, ran the recording studio where much of LAMP's music was cut. This is a house that still exists on 10th and Arlington on the east side of Indianapolis. And this was a guy who had cut he wasn't a music engineer by specialty. Correct me if I'm wrong, Herb, but he cut a lot of industrial recordings for use, radio advertisements, and various use. So yeah, they were working with very rudimentary equipment compared to what I have available on the computer that I'm using to speak with you right now. And that's what's really, I think, beautiful about this story, is just how homegrown it was, and how rudimentary and simple the tools at their disposal were. Yet the brilliance of the artists, they were able to create something that really has endured in ways that I think Herb and all the musicians who contributed to this label are constantly surprised by the ongoing interest, the ongoing appeal of this music.
I have another question about the industry, Herb. When you were working to get airplay for your 45s and your music, did you encounter situations where people were asking for payola? That was a big deal at one time in the business.
It was no pay, no play in the day. And probably still exists. But you had to walk into and talk to a DJ at a radio station. And I mean, if you didn't come with 50 copies of that 45 for free, and some of them demanded 100, you didn't get played. And that's the way it was. Payola was a big thing. It was the only thing. I mean, that's what made it happen. Now, it wasn't as much here locally. Spider Harrison and some of the guys, they got free records, but they helped along the way. I mean, all the DJs locally were good people, and it wasn't, you know, I had to beat them over the head like, you know, some other radio stations throughout the country. But that's the way it was. I mean, that's the way the music business was. That's the way it was built, and that's the way it was designed, and that's what you had to do.
Right.
And I
Did
think
you have a lot of? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
that's all right. I think
Go ahead.
the guys from Chicago were going to circumvent that for me. They were going to take care of that part of it. I just didn't see that as a way of life for me.
Understood.
Could I quickly add something, Susan? Herb referenced
Sure.
Herb referenced a DJ named Spider-Man, and I think this is important to bring up. The founding of Lamp Records coincided with the formation of WTLC in 1968, which was the first full-time Black music, soul music radio station in Indianapolis. And Spider Harrison, was an influential DJ. I think he'd come to Indianapolis from New York, and he really helped nurture this local soul music scene here in Indianapolis and encouraged the musicians and the entrepreneurs like Herb, and played their records and shared them with his colleagues in other cities. Herb, would you agree with that Spider-Man and WTLC really helped become a springboard for you here locally to get this music out to a bigger audience on a national scale?
He definitely did. WTLC had what they called the Great 48. So what I decided to do was, when I was in the distributing business, also, I built Formica record cabinets for Airway. They had 48, and we stocked the Great 48 at Airway on a regular basis every week. When the 48 changed, I took out new records. So that was, Clark came along later. Another DJ was Tony Edwards, and Tony was down in Louisville. But Spider Harrison probably was the closest thing that we had to getting this music on the air at that particular time. And like Kyle said, he was a great influence and a good person to work with.
One last question I think we have time for is there any unreleased Lamp music out there that hasn't seen the radio, the airwaves, or been pressed, that's still in possession?
Any
Unreleased.
other music? You mean something that isn't available?
Yes, that you never released as a 45 or pressed.
Everything that we could find and ordered is on the anthology.
Okay.
There's no loose ends. I don't believe that there
No
is.
loose ends. And how many did you press? Where did you press them?
The anthology?
No, the actual, when you were actually producing and distributing records, how many do you believe that you actually pressed, and where did you create and make the 45s at? Not just recorded them, where were they pressed?
They were pressed in Nashville. Most of them were pressed in Nashville, Tennessee. And I believe that most of the time in the early, when we first got started, I delivered the masters or the tapes down to have the masters done. And all of them were pretty much manufactured. And there were, I mean, we did thousands of records back then. So I don't know numbers, but I think Nashville is the answer to that question.
Well, it's sad to hear there's no hidden gems out there that we might be able to get Kyle to help us bring out, but I'm glad that Kyle
I
has
think there
found
are.
so many loose ends.
I think that the music that Herb recorded is mostly out there. Although there's a couple early singles that you recorded for the Highlighters, Herb, that have never surfaced. There were sessions, there was probably an acetate that was produced, but those just disappeared. But the groups themselves that recorded for LAMP, there's still a lot of unreleased material out there. It might not be music they recorded for LAMP, but the groups that worked with LAMP, there's a lot of unreleased music still out there. So the story, I think this is good, not to contradict her, but I think there's more to the story to come, hopefully. Yeah.
Well, we'd love to have you back and do round 2 on this. Mr. Miller, hope you're up for the challenge to tell us more about your story and about the music and about what you did after LAMP. It's quite intriguing.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I'd be happy to do that.
All
Hey,
right.
Nicole.
Yes. All right, I'll take it away. All right, so next Thursday, we will continue with our History Happy Hour with Miami, People with a Living Past with Diane Hunter. So if you're interested in Indigenous peoples, tune in next Thursday, same place, same time, same Zoom link. On Saturday, we'll be decoding your family documents with a workshop diving into how to preserve and understand your family papers with IHS archivists and conservation staff. On Tuesday, June 30th, join us for Real History as we dive into the fact and fiction behind the Netflix limited series Self-Made, inspired by the life of Madam C.J. Walker. Also, sign up for this at indianahistory.org for more information about these programs and other virtual offerings coming to an internet connection to you. So we want to give you a huge thanks to Kyle for helping along to help us tell the story of LAMP Records. Yay! And also for Herb. What a treasure you are. And if you want to know more about Kyle's work, there is a radio show for that. So join him on Cultural Manifesto, heard weekly on Wednesdays at 8 p.m. or Saturdays at 10 p.m. At your local Indianapolis NPR station, WFYI. And anytime on WFYI.org. If you missed your chance to donate or you would like to make a future gift to support Indiana Historical Society, please visit indianahistory.org/virtual resources/donate. Your donation will help us allow to continue this kind of work and to help continue Hoosier, telling Hoosier history and Hoosier stories. You'll get an email from us tomorrow morning with all of these links and a survey included. It will take 1 minute, and we'd love to know what you thought about this program and how we can make programs like this better and more interesting. We'll post a conversation to IHS, our YouTube channel, in the upcoming weeks. So thank you all for being here tonight. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we hope to see you at an upcoming event. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Thanks.